This is a murder investigation.
We've discovered a dead body in our city. That's not something that happens every day.
First 24 hours to 48 hours of any investigation, that is absolutely critical.
Something bad has happened.
Secure the scene and don't screw up. It's a high-profile case.
I found a lot of bodies. What made this so unusual is the way that it unfolded. Nobody saw this coming.
The plastic bag containing a body part.
You see these bindings on her wrist, a million things are going through your head.
What happened to her when she walked in that evening was unforgivable.
Most of the people that have moved in recently have no idea it even happened here. It's a house of horrors.
There are still several body parts missing.
I look down and I can't believe what I'm seeing.
What's in the bag pulls back the bag and shows me what appears to be.
How on earth could anybody do that to another human being?
I have dealt in excess of 1,000 violent, sudden, unexplained deaths.
But this is on another level.
Please, how can I help?
I think I found the body. My name's Tony Snowden, pump attendant, Great Culvert Pumping Station. I can't believe it's human harm. I don't know what I'm thinking. I feel shocked.
The wife's getting the kids ready for school, and we get a call on the landline. It's the Assistant Chief Constable who said that an arm has been found. Paul Davison, first on scene, Senior Investigating Officer. So my mind quickly starts racing because it's the first Senior Investigating Officer role with that level of a crime. I get in my car and I'm thinking, what am I going to do? We've got a body part which has been dismembered from the body. So I get to the scene.
Making my way to the scene of the pumping station. The scene's locked down. I'm not rushing this journey because nothing is going to change and nothing's going to happen until I actually arrive. My name's Trevor Logley, first on scene crime scene manager. I want time to think about the resources, the people that I may possibly need, and how I'm going to coordinate such a large scene. I want to make sure that everything's done according to the book.
I'm driving towards the pumping station. I'm seeing people going about the normal business, mothers taking the children to school, and I'm thinking I would rather be doing anything other than going to deal with a set of circumstances when I might well be out of my depth.
I've arrived at the scene, and the first thing I noticed is that the entire scene is enclosed by a high, 6-foot-tall metal fence, which immediately gave me some reassurance because within that, the scene is controlled.
I can only describe as a rubbish heap, which is formed by a small crane which collects rubbish from the drain. and then puts it into the weed heap that I'm looking at now.
There's a large brick building, and approximately 15 yards opening up in front of me is an area of debris stretching away in front of me where the body part has been recovered from.
The head of scenes of crime is already there. He takes me over to where the arm is laid on the ground. The arm is severed at the shoulder, and I'm looking at the fingers, and parts of the fingers are missing. A dog at the scene had pulled the arm out of a black bin liner. And I noticed the word chaos tattooed in faded blue scrawl. It didn't look to me like it had been done professionally.
There is a missing person report out in relation to a lady called Natalie Clubb with the recording of a tattoo on the arm.
She'd been arrested in the past as a sex worker, and I was hoping that very quickly we might be able to establish that the arm did belong to Natalie Clubb without doing further extensive DNA tests. If it was Natalie Clubb, I'd absolutely no idea what had happened to her. Was it a punter where something's gone wrong and the punter's murdered Natalie Clubb and then tried to get rid of the body? Could it be somebody closer to home? There'd been other sex workers murdered in recent months, each with a different scene investigating officer. And I'm thinking that this is possibly a sequence of tragic murders.
My first priority is that there is no potential of any form of cross-contamination entering or leaving.
I'm thinking that what I'm going to do in the coming hours and days would have to stand up to scrutiny at Crown Court.
You can't visit a scene without leaving some trace of your visit behind you. And you can't leave that same scene without taking a trace of that scene with you. What I didn't need was a rogue DNA profile or a rogue footprint suddenly turning up and not being able to be accounted for.
In my mind, I'm thinking, how was it done? Are there any weapons or other items concealed at the scene?
As I walked through the expanse of the debris, I just thought, how on earth am I going to be able to sift through this systematically? The scale of the task, the logistics, I'd never encountered before.
It's going to take some time for the search of the grounds to take part. So I decide then to fly over the scene in the helicopter to try and get an overview of what I'm looking for. The pumping station is remote. There's nothing surrounding it apart from fields. As I looked at the drain upstream, there's nothing, there's no houses, no people. And so if somebody had dumped parts of that person's body in the drain, it was very unlikely that there would be any witches at all.
I've got my protective clothing on and had a few moments to gather my thoughts. In the middle of this debris, I'm looking at a plastic bag. And the obvious question is, what's in the bag?
I get out of the helicopter.
And I can see that the end is already open.
I get a call.
I'm looking into the plastic bag.
To say to me,
at this time, you can see
they have found
what appears to be
a head
decomposed,
wrapped in a bin bag. I'm stood looking at a head, completely decomposed, and it's not something I've seen before, a severed head. There are no eyes, no nose. All I'm seeing is maggots and hair. It was the head of a female. It was probably one of the worst things I've seen. How on earth could anybody do that to another human being?
It's a matter of being able to put it into a box when you go home, because otherwise we'd think the nightmares would be pretty horrific.
My heart's sinking really, because I'm thinking that this probably isn't the scene of the murder.
The Great Culvert pumping station has a grid across the entire drain. That acts as a sieve, and they have to use a mechanical grab to clear the sieve that's across the front of the drain of debris. Something as large as a plastic bag containing a body part would get caught in that. The debris that's been taken out of the drain is being dumped on a tractor-type trailer. I was a bit concerned as to the actual size and amount of debris that would have to be hand-sifted and, to ensure that all body parts had been recovered.
The underwater diver arrives, and I instruct the underwater search team officers to walk and dive the scene for up to a quarter mile upstream of the turbines.
We're going to get 5 divers ready and do an initial search on the upstream side of the pumps. Ron Morton, first on scene, underwater search unit. Hopefully we might find any of the smaller body parts that have not already been found, or any kind of evidence relating to the death of the person involved.
There are an obvious number of places where the body parts in the sacks could have been deposited.
It's pretty dark inside of here. The diver, however, will have no visibility in there once he gets in the water, so he'll conduct a fingertip search. So he will just sweep his hand backwards and forwards and work his way up and down. As he is searching, he will move himself small amounts at a time and overlap the areas that is searched, so that basically, in effect, the area probably gets searched double. We are using a diver's necklace. First diver is on a lifeline, and each diver subsequently is connected on a shorter lifeline to the diver next to him. So you get a string of divers. We search the key areas that we can search. And we've found nothing of any evidential value at this moment.
And so all I've got at the moment is an arm, a head, and some bin liners, nothing else. And I'm then thinking, when was she killed? Where was she killed? Where was she cut up? How difficult this is going to be to investigate because of the chaotic lifestyle of people working in that industry. We needed to move in fast time because in the first 24 hours to 48 hours of any investigation, that is absolutely critical.
I needed to secure the scene, make sure it was protected, make sure nobody came in and out without my knowledge, make sure nothing was moved unless I knew about it, and then look at our priorities. We've got a head, we've got an arm, we need to get those sorted out, we need to know what we're dealing with.
I want to conduct the post-mortem with a pathologist There's a tremendous amount of work to do. You have all sorts of thoughts running through your head. Will I be able to solve the crime? Have I got the skills to ultimately find the killer? I've dealt with lots of crimes in my past, very serious crimes, but this is on another level. I left the scene, and in my head, this was a major murder investigation that needed to be launched. At the briefing, I set main lines of inquiry that I needed to get up and running now. Some of them were Natalie Club's background, assuming it was Natalie, associates and friends.
From the onset, it was apparent it was a very complex and very detailed investigation. Detective Sergeant Sean Weir, interviewing officer.
Darren Adams, the boyfriend, and also Pimp had reported her missing from a public phone box on the 14th of May.
The missing person account gave details of when Darren last saw Natalie in the red light area, and she'd never been seen again.
The missing person officer had been back to 119 St John's Grove on a number of occasions after Darren Adams had reported her missing.
At the time that Natalie went missing, 2 sex workers had already been murdered. And so there was a great amount of concern amongst the girls on the street.
Darren Adams was somebody of interest, obviously, because he was Natalie's boyfriend, if it was Natalie.
I found myself thinking about Natalie's family. Andy Marshall, first on scene, interviewing officer, the major witness. A determination to try and do my best, as if it had maybe happened to a member of my own family.
It was clear that this was going to be a very complex murder to solve. I'm hoping that we get some idea of how she died. All we had was the head and the arm at that point. The atmosphere in the mortuary was quite sombre, to say the least.
There are 2 fingerprint experts examining the hand and palm of the dismembered arm.
I'm really, really hoping that we can get something from the palm to prove that it is Natalie Clubb.
They applied the lifting tape and removed the palm mark. I believe it was in aluminium powder, and then they mounted it onto a Cobex sheet and took it back to the fingerprint bureau.
Then the pathologist moved on to the post-mortem on the head. There was this awkward, eerie silence. We're just kind of looking at each other. It seemed like time stood still, because I've never seen a severed head before, and I'm pretty sure that most of the people hadn't either.
It was a decomposed human head.
It had been dismembered at the 6th cervicular by a serrated knife of some kind. He wasn't able to tell me very much because it was almost completely decomposed. It's been a long, difficult day. I've been on duty since 7:30 for about 12 to 18 hours. I was tired, emotionally drained, couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, the phone rings. It's the head of scenes of crime officer. Great news, it's definitely Natalie Clubb. This was a massive break for the investigation. Natalie was just an ordinary mum. She suffered, I think, from her past, and some said, her family said, she tattooed chaos on her arm because that's what she caused wherever she went. I got a great deal of sympathy for her, but she found brief happiness with her husband, and they had 3 children in quick succession. And for whatever reason, the marriage fell apart. She moved to Hull looking for a brighter future, but unfortunately that's where she met Darren Adams.
The second day, we recovered further bin bags.
They discovered a heavy, large object inside 2 or 3 bin liners, which had all been tied separately.
It was a fairly safe assumption these bags contained body parts. We decided to keep them closed, put them straight into forensic body bags, seal those, and get them x-rayed, take them onto the mortuary where they could be opened in a safe, secure environment in sterile conditions.
I was trying to get my head around the enormity of what I was dealing with. Would I get a cause of death? And that was uppermost in my mind. If there was no cause of death, it'd be very, very difficult to charge anybody with murder. It was laid on the mortuary slab, and the pathologist gently removed the first bin liner. Then he carefully removed the second bin liner, which revealed the back of the torso, which had completely decomposed.
And it was at this point 5 or 6 puncture wounds identified in the chest of the torso.
His conclusion at the end of the post-mortem was that she'd been kicked or punched with a fist or a shod foot, which probably would have knocked her over. And then somebody probably sat on top of her and stabbed her repeatedly with quite close puncture wounds, and they were ante-mortem.
Hull made a policy decision at that time to keep the cause of death strictly between the people that were present at that post-mortem.
The only other person or persons who knew how she died would be the killer or killers. I knew I'd have to keep that as a card up my sleeve. I'm wondering how to progress this investigation forward. I would have to employ some tactics around witnesses, the force I'd never seen before, which would be controversial. Most of the witnesses would be heroin addicts. I put everybody on video to show the jury eventually that this investigation was conducted to the highest standard possible. I remember thinking, we need to get Adams on video.
Myself and my colleague Rob were responsible for the interviews of Darren Adams and hopefully help detect a nasty, heinous crime. Sean Weir, first on scene, officer in the case and responsible for all interviews with the suspect Darren Adams. Natalie got embroiled in a very chaotic lifestyle. Darren Adams was also somewhat of a career criminal.
For Natalie to bring punters back to 119 St John's Grove, Adams would be waiting with a baseball bat and knuckle dusters to rob hunters. You were looking at potentially hundreds of clients who might have a grudge.
The associates of Darren Adams were generally of the criminal fraternity, dealers, users, very much the underbelly of the city. Initially, Darren Adams was treated as the grieving boyfriend, which gave us a great starting point. We could then try to drill holes through his account later when he became a suspect. We then was tasked with putting together an interview plan for Adams. That in itself took weeks. I remember it was an 126-page document that would contain all the crucial evidence. It's designed to elicit responses from Darren Adams, probe, interrogate.
Obviously, Adams was a person of interest, but I thought it might be another prostitute murder.
It's like putting a big jigsaw together.
Neil Patterson emerged as somebody close to Adams and Natalie. He actually owned the premises, 119 St John's Grove, and he had a soft spot for Natalie. But Patterson wasn't an addict, which set him apart completely from the other people we're seeing. So I put Andy Marshall on to Patterson. This wasn't going to be instant. This is not like on the television, you know, very quick admission. It doesn't work like that.
I needed to find out from him every little bit of information he knew about Natalie Clubb. Andy Marshall, first on scene, interviewing officer for the major witness, Neil Patterson. It was quite obvious that he was shocked as to what had happened to her. He was willing to help.
The problem was that he was arrested and charged and on remand for the vicious murder on an elderly lady during a robbery.
I had this gut feeling that after the initial meeting with Neil, he knew more than he'd first given us, information-wise. So we decided that we would get permission to go visit him in prison. I was surprised and shocked when he looked me straight in the eye and said, "Get me out of the prison, into police custody, and we'll talk."
In those months that intervened, where we're still working hard to get Adams charged with Natalie's murder.
The interview stages are basically looking at their lifestyle and their background. You want some affirmation that they actually have lived at St John's Grove, that he was in a relationship with Natalie Clubb, etc. So that when you get to the final stages where you've got your crucial evidence, you can actually challenge him.
Natalie's murder is not likely associated with the other prostitute murders on the go at that time. Adams obviously is the boyfriend, so any profiler will tell you look close to home.
He was very cold and calculated. I recall him standing up and banging on the table and getting very agitated with me. When I gently and calmly just produced photographs of Natalie's torso, head and a dismembered body, basically. He didn't show any reaction at all until he hung his head on the last one, the one with the hand and chaos.
St John's Grove was the scene of the crime and the focus of the investigation. We went in through the rear door. It was stomach-churning squalor, urine-soaked furniture, hypodermic needles, rubbish, bin liners. Could she have been cut up there? I just didn't know who I was dealing with at the time. So again, just keeping a complete open mind. And we made the decision then to get it boarded up with metal shutters, so we'd have complete control. I needed to surveil Adams to see if he could lead us to more body parts and so forth. But uppermost in my mind was the fact that he was an addict, and I didn't want anything to harm to come to him.
In the 90s, during the murder, it's even opened my eyes, the level of drugs, particularly heroin, in the city of Hull. It was a real problem. People were having to commit crime to fund their habits, to be able to afford the heroin.
Andy Marshall was also in the surveillance squad, so I was happy that I got the right people to follow Adams to see if he could lead us to any more evidence.
A surveillance operative is somebody who can covertly or overtly follow an individual without them being aware they're being followed, listening to them, talking to other people as to what they're saying.
He basically walked into a house while our family were watching television, ripped the television up and walked out whilst it was still playing. We couldn't let it run, so we had to get him arrested. Now Adams was a focus. Concentrate on the ones closest to him and try and get them to talk. We arrest Michael Larvin, who was an associate of Adams as well. We got no forensic evidence. We don't know when she was killed. Now it was down to the detectives to concentrate on the ones closest to him and try and get them to talk on the basis that Adams must have told somebody what he'd done. I pulled some strings to get Pattison out of prison, and we take him to Beverley Police Station.
Even though we'd kept to our side of the bargain of getting Neil to the police station, it was obvious that there was an awful lot of work to be done, still trust to be gained, and a long road ahead.
The two detectives just spent time with him, talking to him, taking him out to places, taking him back to the scene, streets of Hull, just building a rapport. They taped all the interviews with him, which showed that the defence wouldn't be able to challenge those conversations.
And we take Neil out to a little village called Paul, and I'm handcuffed to Neil, and we stand on the riverbank looking out to sea. I say to Neil, I think we've been fair with you. I'm going to go home, write down a list of 1 to 10. I want you to have the decency and be truthful as to whether any of those 1 to 10 are correct. Neil, just tick which ones are correct. He ticked 7, and the other 3, he said, you're the detectives, you work it out. It was a slow process with Neil, chipping away on a daily basis, but stressing to him that all we wanted to do was nail the murderers.
Finally, maybe we're going to get more, if there is more to tell.
In the interview room at Beverley Police Station, Neil stated that he'd bumped into Adams on the drain bank near to 119 St John's Grove. And out of the blue, Neil says to me, Darren served her up. This took me completely by shock, and I wasn't aware what Neil was referring to. I asked Neil what he meant, and he said, Darren stabbed her. Being served up in prison slang is stabbing somebody.
As Adams had said, they'd been arguing the night before. His words were we was drugged up on some Russian shit, some temazepam. I just lost it and picked up a knife and stabbed her, woke up in the morning and there was a knife sticking out of her chest.
This is a major breakthrough on the inquiry. The cause of Natalie's death was a secret within the murder inquiry.
Adams shuffled off in the direction of Larvin's house. Then Pattison goes back to see what's happened to Natalie. You know, could I save her? She's still alive. He sees what he thinks are smears of blood on the linoleum. He walks towards the bathroom and opens the door. Then he sees Natalie laid in the bath. And then he touched her and he flinched because he didn't realise she'd be so cold. And obviously he knew then she was dead. And he specifically mentioned a blue blanket covering her chest and on her arms because he pulled back the blanket just to have a look to see whether Adams was truthful about the stab wounds. So that was absolutely crucial to the investigation and massive, absolutely massive. That process took about 10 months. So not an awful lot happened well before he gave us the final earth-shattering instalment.
It was another hot day. Kevin and I were talking to Neil in the exercise yard at Hessle Police Station. We had 3 ice lollies, just talking about things in general, and then like a bolt out of the blue, Neil said, I went to the rear of 119 St John's Grove, and I there saw Darren Adams and Michael Larvin. They were naked from the waist upwards, covered in blood, and washing the blood from each other's body.
He describes the smell in the kitchen as, he says, the only thing I can think of is it was a smell of death. And then he noticed hacksaw blades on the windowsill. Larvin wasn't very happy that he was there.
He saw 9 bin liners in the far end of the kitchen. Adams and Larvin made Neil pick up one of the black bin liners, and he said he knew it contained Natalie's head. And Adams and Larvin said to him, you're now involved, you can't say a thing. My reaction to hearing this was I remember my legs just feeling hollow, a state of shock.
When we got Mr. Patterson's statement, forensic scientists and others were able to go back in the May of the following year, back into that scene, which basically had been completely preserved, and they were able to re-examine that scene. The forensic scientists discovered drag marks and blood marks on the floor of the kitchen. Thankfully, we'd kept that scene, and we were able to revisit it with intelligence-led information and re-examine it and recover those items. I sprayed the walls with a chemical called diazofluorin-19. It produces fingerprints. You have to use a thing called a quasar, which is a high-intensity light source. By altering the frequency, I was able to see writing on the wall which had been painted over in an attempt to disguise those messages, some of which were very crude. One of the most interesting was a message about a series on the TV called Band of Gold, which was about the serial killing of sex workers.
Whilst I'm upstairs, I get a call from Trevor. He kind of sounded excited, so I went downstairs and showed me a bin liner which was empty and creased. He said, what do you think of that?
It appeared to be human flesh, a scalp and hair, and it was a fairly large piece, so it would have caused anybody heavy bleeding. They wouldn't have been well with a piece that size missing.
Now we had evidence of Larvin assisting Darren Adams. So following the discovery of what looked like the piece of skull, it was a worrying 4 days, probably 5, waiting for the DNA to come back. Everybody, the whole team, were nervous. We got a call from the forensic scientist, and he said, I'm going to make your day. It's Natalie. I get a call from another detective, and he says, Larvin wants to talk to us. He said Adams came to see me and admitted killing Natalie, but said he had nothing to do with it. So Larvin cleverly gave us Adams So that was massive.
Neil Patterson eventually gave a full and frank account to what he'd witnessed so we could commit him to the Criminal Justice Act, so that he was then bound to be a witness.
I brought in a guy called Gary Shaw, who is an expert in investigative interviewing. Just like you've got a forensic expert, he's an expert on interviewing. And he agreed when we should charge Adams with murder and Lavin with assistant offender. It's Wednesday the 15th of March 2000, Sheffield Crown Court. I'm worried because this was a circumstantial case based upon the testimony of chaotic individuals, including Patterson. I didn't hold out much hope that we would be successful at the trial.
I'm Andrew Campbell, QC. I was first on the scene in relation to this case when I was instructed by the Crown Prosecution Service to prosecute Darren Adams and Michael Lavin over the murder of Natalie Clubb. The prosecution's case that Darren Adams had murdered his girlfriend Natalie Clubb by stabbing her a number of times in the chest. He then went round to his close friend Michael Lavin and enlisted his help in disposing of the body, which they did by chopping her up in the bath before loading the body parts into black plastic bin liners, which they then took to their car and drove to a waterway in the outskirts of Hull. The prosecution was going to have to rely very strongly on a man called Neil Patterson, who had an extensive criminal record and clearly a motive for being dishonest.
I can remember him walking through the foyer and him just looking at me, and he smiled and he winked, and I just knew then this is going to happen.
There was sufficient supporting evidence to make it likely, despite his criminal record, that the jury would accept his evidence as by and large truthful. And his evidence was very damaging.
Neil Patterson saw the blue blanket on Natalie in the bath, and we recovered blue fibres, several blue fibres from Natalie's decomposed body.
You've got to think of forensic evidence as being like bricks. Very rarely will you get one single piece of forensic evidence which will prove your case.
The fact that if you were going to dismember a body, it would be likely to be in a bath if you did not want to leave obvious signs of blood seeping through floorboards and such like. That was the method of disposal that the pathologist had concluded had taken place. So the jury were able to look at perhaps both those pieces of evidence as supporting the credibility of Patterson.
If Paul hadn't made the decision to keep that scene, we would have lost that. Because the council would have taken the property back over, it had been cleaned, and it had been given back to the next tenant.
It proved to be very, very crucial evidence.
If they believed his evidence, then there was very little chance, no chance, of Darren Adams or Michael Lavin being acquitted.
The trial lasted for about 2 weeks and presented a number of chaotic witnesses from the criminal underworld. I didn't hold out a lot of hope that we would gain a conviction, but 2 weeks later we got a verdict.
I was in the public gallery, and when the judge came back in and saw Adams stand, and then Larvin.
I'm thinking, honestly, I would really rather be anywhere else.
And I got quite emotional, and I don't mind admitting, but after 2 years of your life and dedicating so much, it's an experience I'll never forget for the rest of my life.
Darren Adams receives 25 years minimum term, and so far as Michael Larvin is concerned, 6 years for an assisting an offender.
I've often thought if we hadn't found Natalie, this would have been a grave, wouldn't it?
It was a sad and a horrific end to such a young life, and so really unnecessary.
2 years on the Natalie Club murder, and achieving what we did is quite satisfying.
I remember thinking, this is justice for Natalie.
And her family. I have to stop there, so I get quite emotional now about it. Yeah. Just didn't deserve it.
The Chaos Murder. The Investigation into the Death of Natalie Clubb. Part 1. The Discovery. Chapter It. An Unspeakable Find. The morning of May 16th, 1997, broke over the flat, expansive landscape of the Fens with a deceptive tranquility. A thin, pearlescent mist clung to the low-lying fields, muffling the world in a damp, cool embrace. For Tony Snowden, the day began as hundreds had before it. The familiar rumble of his worn Ford Escort was a steadfast companion on the quiet country lanes leading to the Great Culvert pumping station, a place of functional solitude, far removed from the thrum of city life. Tony, a man in his late 50s with hands calloused by years of manual labor and a face etched with the quiet patience of one who works with machinery, was the pump attendant. His role was one of routine and repetition. He was a guardian of flow, ensuring the intricate network of drains and pumps that kept the surrounding farmland from succumbing to its natural, marshy state operated without fault. The station itself was a stoic, utilitarian structure of brick and steel, a monument to man's ongoing battle with water. Its constant, low-frequency hum was the region's heartbeat. That morning, the air was thick, with the scent of damp earth, wet vegetation, and the faint metallic tang of the machinery. Tony's first task, as always, was to check the debris screen. The Great Culvert acted as the final choke point for a vast network of waterways, and a wide metal grid, a kind of giant sieve, was stretched across the front of the main turbine intake to catch the flotsam and jetsam of the countryside. Fallen branches, agricultural runoff, discarded plastic, and all manner of refuse would pile up against the grid, and if left unchecked, could choke the powerful pumps. He operated the small, crane-like grabber with a practiced ease, its hydraulic arm extending over the dark, swirling water. He lowered the mechanical claw, felt it bite into the dense mat of debris, and hoisted another load onto the growing weed heap on the concrete bank beside the station. It was a messy, thankless job, but one Tony performed with a certain methodical pride. He was clearing the arteries of the land. It was on his third or fourth pass that he noticed it. Amidst the tangled mess of reeds, plastic bottles, and silt-blackened wood, there was a black bin liner. It wasn't an unusual sight in itself. People dumped all sorts of things into the drains, but this one was snagged, and as the crane lifted the surrounding debris, the bag tore open. Something pale and oddly shaped tumbled out, landing with a soft, dull thud on the weed heap. From his perch in the crane's cabin, Tony frowned. It looked wrong. Not like a piece of refuse. He shut down the crane, the sudden silence amplifying the gentle lapping of the water. His steel-toed boots crunched on the gravel as he walked over for a closer look. His dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Buster, who was his constant shadow at the station, had already bounded ahead. Buster was sniffing excitedly at the object, nudging it with his nose. "Get away from that, you daft mutt," Tony called out, his voice a low grumble. As he got closer, his step slowed. The world seemed to narrow, the ambient sounds of the morning fading into a dull roar in his ears. The object was unmistakably a human arm. It was severed cleanly at the shoulder, the flesh pale and puckered from its time in the water. The fingers were curled slightly, as if grasping at something unseen, but it was the detail on the forearm that froze him in place. In a faded bluish-green ink, a single word was tattooed in a messy, amateurish scrawl. Cheos. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Tony Snowden simply stood there, his mind refusing to process the horror laid out before him. This was the stuff of television dramas, of grim newspaper headlines from faraway cities. It was not the stuff of a quiet Tuesday morning at a pumping station in the Fens. A wave of nausea washed over him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He backed away slowly, his gaze locked on the dismembered limb. He fumbled for his mobile phone, his thick fingers trembling so badly he could barely dial. "Police," he managed to say when a calm voice answered. I think I've found something awful." Chapter 2. The Call and the Cascade. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment of the county police control room, the call from Tony Snowden was initially logged with professional detachment. Reports of strange finds were not uncommon. But as the details were relayed, the explicit mention of a human arm, the location, the caller's palpable shock, the atmosphere in the room shifted. A call that might have been routine became a critical incident in a matter of seconds. The information began its rapid, inexorable climb up the chain of command. The duty sergeant, hearing the gravity in the dispatcher's voice, immediately alerted the on-call inspector. Within minutes, the assistant chief constable, ACC, was being briefed over a secure line. The words dismembered, human remains, and pumping station cut through the morning's administrative chatter with chilling clarity. A major investigation was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. For Paul Davison, the day had also started with routine. As a newly promoted detective chief inspector, he was designated as a senior investigating officer, SIO, on the major crime rota. That morning involved paperwork, team meetings, and the endless cascade of emails that defined modern policing. He was nursing a lukewarm coffee at his desk when his office phone rang with the sharp, insistent tone reserved for high-priority calls. It was the ACC. "Paul," the voice on the other end said, "devoid of preamble, a limb has been found at the Great Culvert pumping station. An arm. Looks like a female. I need you there. Your SIO." The words landed like stones in the pit of Davison's stomach. He was a veteran detective with years of experience investigating the darkest facets of human behavior. But the specter of a dismemberment case was something else entirely. It spoke of a level of violence and cold-blooded calculation that was rare and deeply disturbing. His mind, trained by years of experience, immediately began racing, constructing a mental checklist, firing off a series of critical questions to himself. What am I going to do? The thought was not one of panic, but of immense, sobering responsibility. The first few hours, the golden hours of any murder investigation, are absolutely critical. Decisions made now could determine the outcome of the entire case. Evidence could be lost, contaminated, or overlooked. The mantra of every detective echoed in his head. Secure the scene and don't screw up. He grabbed his keys and coat, his mind already shifting from the administrative tasks of the morning to the complex, high-stakes chess game of a murder inquiry. As he walked briskly through the station, the news was already beginning to ripple through the ranks. He gave curt, clear instructions to his deputy. "Get a cordon log started. I want a full forensic team ready to deploy. Get me crime scene manager Trevor Logley on the phone. Tell him to meet me there." Driving towards the Fens, Davison watched the familiar urban landscape give way to open fields and vast, empty skies. Mothers were walking their children to school. People were heading to work. The world was moving to its normal daily rhythm. It was a jarring contrast to the grim reality he was driving towards. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were already operating in a different, darker dimension that ran parallel to this peaceful one. He thought, I would rather be doing anything other than this. There was a cold knot of apprehension in his gut, the fear that every good detective carries, the fear of being out of one's depth, of facing a puzzle so complex and a killer so depraved that justice might remain just out of reach. Simultaneously, Trevor Logley, the force's most experienced crime scene manager, CSM, was receiving his own call. Logley was the master of the scene, the man responsible for ensuring that the chaotic aftermath of a violent crime could be meticulously and systematically deconstructed to reveal the secrets it held. Where Davison commanded the overall investigation, Logley commanded the physical space where the crime was discovered. As he drove, Logley wasn't rushing. Haste, he knew, was the enemy of forensic integrity. Nothing is going to change, and nothing's going to happen until I actually arrive, he thought. He used the travel time to plan, visualizing the scene based on the scant information he had. A pumping station, a body part, a large debris field. He began mentally assembling his team and resources. He would need forensic photographers, evidence recovery specialists, and likely, given the location, specialist search teams. He thought about access points, contamination pathways, and the sheer logistical scale of what might be required. His job was to bring order to the most profound disorder imaginable. He had to ensure that every action taken at the scene would stand up to the intense scrutiny of a Crown Court trial, potentially years down the line. The two men, Davison, the investigator, and Logley, the forensic manager, were now converging on a single point on the map, a lonely pumping station that had, in an instant, become the epicenter of a major murder investigation. Chapter 3. The Scene of Unspeakable Things. Upon arriving at the Great Culvert pumping station, Paul Davison was met with a scene of controlled professional activity. The initial responding officers had established a wide primary cordon, their blue and white tape, a stark, jarring line against the muted greens and browns of the landscape. A single point of entry and exit was being established, and a cordon log was in place, a simple but non-negotiable record of every single person who entered or left the secured area. Davison's first impression was one of relief. The entire station was enclosed by a high, 6-foot-tall metal fence. This immediately simplified the initial task of scene security. Inside this perimeter, the environment was, for the moment, sterile. Trevor Logley arrived shortly after, his large, fully equipped van parking at the designated rendezvous point. The two men, who had worked together on numerous serious cases, exchanged a brief, grim nod. There was no need for pleasantries. They walked together towards the heart of the scene, their footsteps the only sound besides the ever-present hum of the pumps. The head of the Scenes of Crime unit was already there. He led them to the weed heap, and there it was, laid carefully on a sterile plastic sheet where the first officers had moved it, was the arm. Seeing it firsthand was different from hearing it described over the phone. It was undeniably human, achingly fragile. The word chaos seemed to shout from the pale skin, a declaration from a life now brutally extinguished. Logley began his methodical assessment, his eyes scanning every detail. He noted the missing fingertips, a detail that could suggest post-mortem animal activity or something more sinister. He observed the black bin liner from which the arm had come, now a critical piece of evidence in its own right. His mind was already cataloging the forensic opportunities. DNA, fingerprints, trace evidence on the bag, tooling marks on the bone from the dismemberment. Davison's focus was broader. He was trying to read the story the scene was telling him. The pumping station is remote, he observed aloud, his gaze sweeping over the surrounding fields. There's nothing surrounding it apart from fields. No houses, no people. He reasoned that if someone had dumped body parts into the drain, it was highly unlikely there would have been any witnesses. The location was chosen for its isolation. This was a calculated act. The killer had wanted to dispose of the body where it would not easily be found. The grid at the pumping station had been their undoing. It had acted as a sieve, catching what they had intended to be washed away and forgotten. While Logley began to direct his team, forensic specialists now arriving and donning their sterile white suits, Davison made a decision. He needed a bird's-eye view. He called for the force helicopter. From the air, the scale of the challenge became even more apparent. The pumping station was a tiny island of industry in a sea of green. The drain snaked its way across the landscape, a dark ribbon of water. As they flew upstream, the view confirmed Davison's initial assessment. There was nothing. No obvious entry points, no bridges in the immediate vicinity, no houses overlooking the water. This was a dumping ground, not a murder scene. The killer had come here specifically for the purpose of disposal. Back on the ground, a chilling update came over the radio. Logley's team, meticulously sifting through the debris heap, had found another black plastic bag. It was heavier than the first. The question hung in the air, unspoken but terrifying. What's in the bag? A senior forensic officer, with Davison and Logley watching, carefully opened the sodden, knotted plastic. The stench that erupted was overpowering, the smell of advanced decomposition. Inside, wrapped in another layer of plastic, was a human head. The sight was grotesque, a vision from a nightmare. The features were almost completely gone, consumed by the processes of decay and the relentless work of maggots. There were no eyes, no nose, just a horrifying mass of tissue, hair, and bone. It was impossible to determine age or identity, but the long, matted hair suggested it was female. Even for seasoned veterans like Davison and Logley, it was a profoundly shocking moment. How on earth could anybody do that to another human being? Davison murmured, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and disbelief. It was a question that would hang over the entire investigation. This wasn't just a murder. It was a desecration. It was an act of absolute contempt for human life. The discovery of the head confirmed their worst fears. They were dealing with a dismembered body. Somewhere out there were more remains. The heart sank in Davison's chest. The initial crime scene had just expanded exponentially. Every inch of that debris pile had to be searched by hand. Every inch of the drain, upstream and downstream, had to be scoured. The logistical and emotional burden on his team would be immense. He looked at the decomposed head and the severed arm. He had a victim, but she had no name, no voice. His primary, urgent task was to give her one. The faded blue tattoo was his only real lead. Chapter 4. The Chaos Tattoo. While the grim search continued at the pumping station, the investigation's first crucial breakthrough was taking shape miles away, in the quiet, methodical world of police databases. The description of the arm, and specifically the unique Chaos Tattoo, was circulated to all relevant departments, with a particular focus on the Missing Persons Bureau. It didn't take long to get a hit. The details matched a report filed just 2 days earlier, on May 14th. A man named Darren Adams had reported his girlfriend, 9-year-old Natalie Clubb, missing. Adams, a known figure to local police with a string of minor offenses, claimed he had last seen her working in the city's red light district. The missing person report, filed by an officer who had spoken with Adams, contained a crucial detail. It mentioned that Natalie had a distinctive, self-administered tattoo on her forearm that read Chaos. Suddenly, the nameless victim had a potential identity. Natalie Clubb, a mother of 3, a woman who had fallen into the chaotic and dangerous world of street-level sex work and drug addiction. Davison now had a name, a face to put to the horror. But he needed confirmation. He couldn't inform a family based on a potential match. He needed scientific certainty. The focus shifted to the mortuary, where the arm and head had been transported. The atmosphere in the mortuary was cold and somber, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic. Under the harsh, unforgiving lights, 2 fingerprint experts began the delicate and difficult task of trying to recover a print from the waterlogged hand. The skin was fragile, and they worked with the painstaking precision of watchmakers. Using specialized techniques and powders, they carefully treated the palm. Slowly, miraculously, a viable palm print began to emerge. They applied lifting tape, gently peeling back a perfect impression of the unique ridges and whorls. The print was mounted and rushed to the Fingerprint Bureau for comparison against the police's national database. Natalie Clubb, due to a past minor arrest, had prints on file. The wait was agonizing. Davison and his core team had gathered in the incident room, a space that was rapidly transforming into the nerve center of the investigation. Whiteboards were being filled with timelines, names, and locations. The phone rang constantly. Every detective felt the oppressive weight of the clock. The first 48 hours were ticking away. Then the call came. It was the head of the Fingerprint Bureau. The tone was unequivocal. It's a positive match. The palm print belongs to Natalie Clubb. A wave of grim confirmation washed through the incident room. Their victim had a name. The investigation could now move forward with a new, sharper focus. They weren't just investigating a collection of body parts found in a drain. They were investigating the murder of Natalie Clubb. This breakthrough, however, brought with it a fresh wave of challenges. Natalie's lifestyle was, by her own tattooed admission, chaotic. She was involved with drugs, sex work, and dangerous people. The pool of potential suspects was vast and murky. Her boyfriend and pimp, Darren Adams, the very man who had reported her missing, immediately became a person of primary interest. Was his report a genuine act of concern or a cynical, calculated attempt to deflect suspicion? Davison knew he was staring into a complex and treacherous underworld. His investigation would depend on navigating a world where trust was a foreign concept and alliances shifted like sand. But for now, he had a starting point. He had a victim. And he had a prime suspect. The game was afoot. Part 2. The Victim. Chapter 5. A Life Interrupted. With her identity confirmed, the investigation underwent a fundamental shift. The focus was no longer solely on the what and how of the crime, but on the who. Who was Natalie Clubb? To understand why she died, the detectives had to understand how she had lived. A dedicated team was assigned to build a comprehensive victimology profile, piecing together the fragmented narrative of her life. What they uncovered was a story of profound sadness, of a woman caught between her deep love for her family and the destructive forces of her personal demons. Natalie wasn't just a statistic from the red light district. She was a daughter, a sister, and most importantly, a mother. She had 3 young children, born in quick succession during a marriage that had, for a time, promised her a conventional happiness. Friends and family described her as a vibrant, loving mother, but one who was haunted by a troubled past and a restless spirit. The chaos tattoo, her family explained, was a self-deprecating acknowledgement of the turmoil she felt she often brought into the lives of those around her. It was a brand she had given herself, a label for the internal storm she could never quite quell. Her marriage eventually crumbled under the strain, and in the aftermath, seeking a fresh start and a brighter future for herself and her children, she moved to the city of Hull. But Hull, instead of being a sanctuary, became the place where her life spiraled out of control. It was there that she met Darren Adams. He was charismatic and controlling, a career criminal who preyed on vulnerable women. He drew Natalie into his orbit, exploiting her dependencies and pulling her deeper into the world of heroin, addiction, and sex work. He became her boyfriend, her protector, and her pimp, a toxic trifecta that isolated her from her family and trapped her in a cycle of desperation. The detectives learned that the address, where she had been living, 119 St. John's Grove, was more than just a home. It was the base of operations for Adams. It was a place where Natalie would bring clients, only for Adams to be waiting with a baseball bat or knuckle dusters to rob them. It was a nexus of crime, drugs, and violence. The list of people who might have had a grudge against Natalie, or more likely against Adams, was potentially endless. As the detectives spoke with Natalie's estranged family, a portrait emerged of a woman they loved deeply but had been powerless to save. They spoke of her laughter, her fierce love for her kids, and the heartbreaking phone calls where the desperation in her voice was palpable. They had watched from a distance as the bright, hopeful young woman they knew was slowly consumed by the darkness of her new life. For Davison and his team, this process was vital. It transformed the case from a clinical exercise in evidence gathering into a deeply human tragedy. Every new detail about Natalie's life, her favorite music, her bond with her children, her unrealized dreams fueled their determination. They weren't just seeking a conviction. They were seeking justice for a woman who had been systematically failed long before her life was so brutally taken. Chapter 6. The House on St. John's Grove. With Darren Adams now firmly established as the prime suspect, 119 St. John's Grove became the focal point of the investigation. If Natalie had been murdered, the detectives reasoned, the most likely location was the place where she lived with a man who controlled her life. A team was dispatched to execute a search warrant. The moment they stepped through the door, they were hit by an almost physical wave of squalor and despair. The house was a scene of utter dereliction. The air was thick and foul, a putrid cocktail of stale cigarette smoke, urine, and rotting food. The floor was a treacherous landscape of discarded food wrappers, overflowing bin liners, and dirty clothes. Used hypodermic needles littered the surfaces, their orange caps like poisonous flowers blooming amidst the filth. The furniture was stained and broken, the walls grimy. It was, as one detective would later describe it, stomach-churning. This was the environment in which Natalie Clubb had spent her final days. This was the home Darren Adams had provided for her. The scene spoke volumes about the nature of their relationship and the life she had been living. The forensic team, led by Trevor Logley, faced a monumental task. How do you find trace evidence of a murder in a house that is already a biohazard? Every surface was a potential source of contamination. They moved with extreme care, documenting the chaos before attempting to find any order within it. Despite the squalor, the house was eerily devoid of any obvious signs of a violent struggle. There were no bloodstains on the walls, no overturned furniture suggesting a fight. It was possible the murder had been swift and unexpected. It was also possible the killer had been meticulous in cleaning up. Davison made a critical, and at the time, somewhat unorthodox decision. Instead of a standard 1 or 2 day forensic sweep, he decided to seize the property entirely. He had the house boarded up with heavy metal shutters, freezing it in time. No one was to enter or leave. 119 St. John's Grove was now a sealed exhibit, a time capsule of misery waiting to be reopened if and when new information came to light. He had a gut feeling that the house held more secrets than it was currently revealing, and he was determined to preserve it until he had the key to unlock them. This decision, born of intuition and experience, would later prove to be one of the most important of the entire investigation. Chapter 7. The Grieving Boyfriend. In the initial stages, Darren Adams was interviewed as a significant witness, the concerned boyfriend who had reported his partner missing. It was a delicate dance for the interviewing officers, Detective Sergeant Sean Weir and his colleague. They needed to gather information, to test his story, but without revealing their suspicion and prompting him to shut down or seek legal counsel. Adams played the part of the grieving partner, but his performance was unconvincing. He was cold, detached, and his story was peppered with inconsistencies. He spoke of Natalie's chaotic lifestyle, her unreliability, subtly painting her as the author of her own misfortune. He described their last moments together, claiming she had gone out to work the streets and simply never returned. The detectives listened patiently, taking meticulous notes, their questioning calm and non-confrontational. They were gathering his version of events, locking him into a narrative that they could later deconstruct, piece by piece. Every lie, every half-truth he told was another thread they could pull on. They decided to put him under covert surveillance. Perhaps he would lead them to the rest of Natalie's body. Perhaps he would confide in an associate. But Adams proved to be a difficult target. His movements were as chaotic as his lifestyle. He was a heroin addict, and his days were dictated by the relentless need to score his next fix. The surveillance team, which included Detective Andy Marshall, watched as Adams committed petty, desperate crimes to fund his habit. On one occasion, he walked into a random family's home while they were watching television, ripped the TV from its stand while it was still playing, and walked out. The surveillance had to be aborted to allow uniformed officers to arrest him, a frustrating but necessary interruption. It was becoming clear that direct pressure on Adams was unlikely to yield a confession. He was too streetwise, too manipulative. The detectives realized they would have to approach the problem from a different angle. They needed to penetrate his inner circle. They began to focus on his known associates, the other inhabitants of the city's criminal underbelly. This led them to a man named Michael Larvin, a close friend of Adams, and, most significantly, it led them to the owner of 119 St. John's Grove, a man named Neil Patterson. Patterson was not a drug addict, which set him apart from the rest of Adams's circle. He was a criminal of a different sort. And, as the detectives would soon discover, he was the key to the entire case. Part 3. The Long Game. Chapter 8. The Witness in Prison. Neil Patterson was an unlikely key to a murder investigation. When the detectives first identified him as a person of interest, he was already incarcerated, on remand for his involvement in a violent robbery that had resulted in the death of an elderly woman. He was a hardened criminal, seemingly worlds away from being a star witness for the prosecution. Yet, he was inextricably linked to the case. He owned the house on St. John's Grove and had a known soft spot for Natalie. He had been a presence in her and Adams's life. Detective Andy Marshall was assigned the task of approaching him. The initial meetings in the sterile prison visiting room were tense and unproductive. Patterson was guarded, suspicious, he gave them nothing. But Marshall, a patient and perceptive detective, sensed something behind the tough facade. He had a gut feeling that Patterson knew more than he was letting on. The investigation into Natalie's murder was grinding on. More of her remains, including her torso, had been recovered from the debris at the pumping station. The post-mortem had revealed the cause of death: multiple stab wounds to the chest. This was the investigation's most valuable secret. Only the killer and anyone they had confided in would know how Natalie had truly died. Weeks turned into months. The investigation team worked tirelessly, interviewing hundreds of people, chasing down countless dead-end leads. The case was in danger of going cold. But Andy Marshall refused to give up on Neil Patterson. He and his partner continued to visit him, not always to question him, but simply to talk. They began to build a rapport, a fragile foundation of trust in a world where trust was a lethal liability. The breakthrough came during one of these visits. Patterson, weary from the pressure, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to help himself, looked Marshall straight in the eye. "Get me out of this prison," he said. "Get me into police custody, and we'll talk." It was a huge gamble. The logistical and legal hurdles were immense, but Davison and his team knew this was their best and perhaps only shot. They pulled strings, called in favors, and made the arrangements. Neil Patterson was temporarily released from the prison system into the custody of the murder investigation team. He was moved to a secure room at Beverly Police Station. They had upheld their side of the bargain. Now it was up to Patterson to uphold his. Chapter 9. The cracks begin to show. Even in the relative comfort of the police station, Patterson did not give up his secrets easily. The process was a slow, painstaking excavation of memory and fear. For 10 months, Andy Marshall and his partner worked with him, employing a strategy of relentless patience. They took him on escorted trips out of the station, back to the streets of Hull, driving past the places that formed the geography of his life with Adams and Natalie. They talked about everything and anything, slowly chipping away at the wall he had built around himself. Every conversation was meticulously documented, recorded on tape, to ensure that every step of the process was transparent and unassailable in court. They needed his testimony, but it had to be obtained without coercion, his credibility preserved at all costs. The turning point came on a trip to a quiet, windswept spot on the bank of the River Humber. As they stood looking out at the gray, choppy water, Marshall made a direct appeal. "Neil, I think we've been fair with you," he said. "I'm going to go home tonight and write down a list of 10 things, 10 scenarios about what might have happened to Natalie. All I want you to do is be truthful. Just tick the ones that are correct." The next day, Marshall presented him with the list. Patterson read it carefully. Then, with a steady hand, he ticked 7 of the boxes. For the other 3, he looked at Marshall and said, "You're the detectives. You work it out." It was a massive step forward. He had confirmed key aspects of the police theory without having to voice them himself, but the full story remained locked away. The detectives continued their patient work, building on this new foundation of trust. Then, one day in an interview room, it happened. They were discussing the days after Natalie's disappearance. Out of the blue, Patterson said a single chilling sentence that changed everything. "Darren served her up." The detectives were momentarily stunned. Served her up was prison slang for stabbing someone. "What do you mean, Neil?" Marshall asked, his voice calm, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "He stabbed her," Patterson said, his voice low. And then, the story began to pour out. Chapter 10. The confession at second hand. According to Patterson, he had bumped into a frantic Darren Adams on the drain bank near 119 St. John's Grove shortly after Natalie had disappeared. Adams was agitated, high on a cocktail of drugs he called Russian shit. He confessed to Patterson that he and Natalie had been arguing the night before. "I just lost it," Adams had told him. "I picked up a knife and stabbed her." He claimed he had passed out and, upon waking in the morning, found Natalie dead, with a knife still sticking out of her chest. This was the moment the investigation had been waiting for. This was the holdback evidence. Only the killer knew she had been stabbed. And now, Adams had told Patterson, the secret was out. Patterson's account continued, each detail more horrifying than the last. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a faint hope that Adams was lying, Patterson had gone back to the house later. He described finding smears of what he thought was blood on the linoleum floor. He walked towards the bathroom and pushed open the door. There, he saw Natalie. She was lying in the bathtub, her body cold to the touch. A blue blanket was covering her chest. Overcoming his fear, he pulled back the blanket to see if Adams had been telling the truth. He saw the stab wounds. This detail, the blue blanket, was absolutely crucial. It was something only a person who had been at the scene could have known. Patterson's story didn't end there. After months more of painstaking work by the detectives, the final, earth-shattering installment of his testimony emerged. It was a hot day, and Marshall and his partner were talking with Patterson in the exercise yard of the police station. Almost conversationally, as if a dam had finally burst, Patterson recounted the rest of the story. He had gone back to the house one more time. He went around to the rear of 119 St. John's Grove and looked in. There, in the kitchen, he saw Darren Adams and his friend, Michael Larvin. They were both naked from the waist up, covered in blood, washing themselves down. The smell in the kitchen, he said, was unforgettable. "The only thing I can think of," he told the detectives, his voice trembling, "is it was a smell of death." He saw hacksaw blades on the windowsill, and on the floor at the far end of the kitchen were 9 black bin liners, neatly tied. Adams and Larvin, seeing him, forced him to help. They made him pick up one of the bags. It was heavy, and from its shape, he said he knew, with sickening certainty, that it contained Natalie's head. "You're involved now," Adams had told him, a threat hanging in the air. "You can't say a thing." Chapter 11. Corroboration. Patterson's testimony was explosive, but it was still the word of one convicted criminal against another. Davison knew that to stand a chance in court, he needed to corroborate every possible detail with hard, physical evidence. This was the moment his decision to seal the house on Street, Johns Grove, would pay its dividend. Armed with the detailed roadmap provided by Patterson, Trevor Logley and his forensic team re-entered the House of Horrors. They were no longer searching blind. They were looking for specific evidence in specific places. They sprayed the kitchen floor with luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin, causing trace amounts of blood to glow with an eerie blue light. Under the blackout curtains, the floor lit up, revealing drag marks leading towards the bathroom, the path where Natalie's body had likely been moved. They examined the bath and the plumbing, finding microscopic traces of blood and tissue that had survived the killer's cleanup attempts. On the windowsill in the kitchen, just as Patterson had described, they found microscopic metal fragments consistent with a hacksaw being used on bone. The most shocking discovery came when a forensic scientist, re-examining the grimy walls, used a high-intensity light source and special filters. The technique, which can reveal details hidden under layers of paint, uncovered messages that had been painted over. One was a crude reference to a popular TV series at the time about the serial killing of sex workers. It was a chilling insight into the mindset of the killer. Then came the most significant find. Tucked away in a creased, empty bin liner left behind in the kitchen was a small piece of human tissue with hair attached. It appeared to be a piece of scalp. The tension during the 4-day wait for the DNA results was unbearable. The entire case hung in the balance. The call from the forensic lab was jubilant. "I'm going to make your day," the scientist said. "It's Natalie." They now had a direct forensic link. Natalie's DNA was found inside the house, in a context that strongly suggested a violent struggle and dismemberment. Patterson's story was no longer just a story. It was backed by science. The net was closing. Michael Larvin, the alleged accomplice, was brought in for questioning. Faced with the evidence and the knowledge that Patterson was talking, his bravado crumbled. He tried to save himself by sacrificing his friend. He admitted that Adams had come to him and confessed to killing Natalie, though he denied having anything to do with the dismemberment himself. It was another critical piece of the puzzle. After more than a year of relentless, painstaking police work, Paul Davison finally had everything he needed. He gave the order to charge Darren Adams with the murder of Natalie Clubb and Michael Larvin with assisting an offender. Part 4. Justice. Chapter 12. The Trial at Sheffield Crown Court. On March 15, 2000, the trial of Darren Adams and Michael Larvin began at Sheffield Crown Court. The prosecution was led by a seasoned barrister, Andrew Campbell, QC. He knew from the outset that this would be a difficult case. It was almost entirely circumstantial. resting on a foundation built from the testimony of what the defense would undoubtedly portray as unreliable, self-serving criminals. The jury would be asked to believe a man on remand for murder, Neil Patterson, over the defendant. Paul Davison, sitting in the public gallery, felt a profound sense of anxiety. "I didn't hold out much hope that we would be successful," he later admitted. 2 years of his life and the work of his entire team had been poured into this case. Now, it was out of his hands. The prosecution's strategy was to build a wall of evidence, brick by brick. Andrew Campbell described it as just that. "You've got to think of forensic evidence as being like bricks," he explained. "Very rarely will you get one single piece of forensic evidence which will prove your case." The first and most important brick was the testimony of Neil Patterson. As he walked into the courtroom to take the stand, he caught Davison's eye. He smiled and gave a slight, almost imperceptible wink. In that small gesture, Davison saw a flicker of hope. This man was going to see it through. Over several days, Patterson recounted his story to the jury with a quiet, compelling conviction. He spoke of Adams's confession, of seeing Natalie's body in the bath, of the horrific scene of dismemberment in the kitchen. The defense barristers attacked him relentlessly, picking apart his extensive criminal record, accusing him of fabricating the story to win favor and reduce his own sentence. But Patterson remained steadfast, his story unshakable. Then, Campbell began to lay the other bricks on top of Patterson's foundation. He presented the forensic evidence, each piece meticulously corroborating Patterson's account. The blue blanket. Patterson had described a blue blanket covering Natalie's chest in the bath. Campbell revealed that forensic analysis of Natalie's decomposed remains had recovered several microscopic blue fibers, consistent with such a blanket. The method. Patterson described the dismemberment happening in the bath. The pathologist testified that this was the most likely method, as it would contain the blood and make cleanup easier. The preserved scene. The drag marks on the kitchen floor, the hacksaw traces, the painted-over messages, and most powerfully, the piece of Natalie's scalp found in the bin liner. Campbell could argue that this evidence was only found because Patterson had told the police where and what to look for. The decision to seal the house had been vindicated tenfold. The jury was presented with a powerful, interlocking narrative. Patterson's testimony provided the story, and the forensic evidence provided the proof. The chances of Darren Adams being acquitted were diminishing with each new piece of evidence presented. After a trial lasting 2 weeks, the jury retired to consider its verdict. For the detectives and for Natalie's family, the wait was an eternity. Chapter 13. The Verdict. The call came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom reassembled, the air thick with tension. Paul Davison stood in the public gallery, his heart pounding. "I'm thinking honestly, I would really rather be anywhere else," he recalled. Darren Adams and Michael Larvin were led into the dock. The foreman of the jury stood up, a piece of paper trembling in his hand. He cleared his throat and delivered the verdict. On the charge of murdering Natalie Clubb, Darren Adams was found guilty. On the charge of assisting an offender, Michael Larvin was found guilty. A wave of relief and raw emotion washed over Davison. He felt tears welling in his eyes and didn't try to stop them. After 2 years of living and breathing this horrific case, of dedicating so much of his life to it, the fight was over. Justice, in some measure, had been done. The judge sentenced Darren Adams to life in prison, with a minimum term of 25 years. Michael Larvin received a sentence of 6 years. Epilogue. The Echoes of Chaos. In the aftermath, those who worked on the case were left to reflect on the profound tragedy and the extraordinary investigation. It was a case that had pushed them to their limits, emotionally and professionally. It was a testament to patient, methodical police work, to the power of forensic science, and to the courage of a single, unlikely witness who chose to break the criminal code of silence. For Paul Davison, the case left an indelible mark. "I've often thought if we hadn't found Natalie, this would have been a grave, wouldn't it?" he said, his voice thick with emotion years later. It was a sad and a horrific end to such a young life, and so really unnecessary. The murder of Natalie Clubb was a story born of chaos. The chaos of a life spiraling into addiction, the chaos of a violent and controlling relationship, and the ultimate chaos of a brutal, senseless murder. But through the dedicated, meticulous, and deeply human efforts of the police officers who refused to give up, a semblance of order was restored. 2 years on the Natalie Club murder and achieving what we did is quite satisfying, Davison reflected. And I remember thinking, this is justice for Natalie and her family. He paused, the memory still raw. She just didn't deserve it. In the end, the woman who had tattooed chaos on her arm as a symbol of her troubled life became the victim of a chaos far greater than any she could have imagined. Her story serves as a harrowing reminder of the darkness that can exist just beneath the surface of our ordinary world, and of the quiet, determined heroes who work tirelessly to hold that darkness at bay. The Chaos Murder, the investigation into the death of Natalie Club. Part 1, The Discovery. Chapter 8, An Unspeakable Fin. The morning of May 16th, 1997, arrived not with a dawn chorus, but with a slow seeping of gray light into the world. It broke over the flat, expansive landscape of the Fens with a tranquility that was both profound and utterly deceptive. A thin, pearlescent mist clung to the low-lying fields, a spectral shroud that muffled the world in a damp, cool embrace, blurring the lines between earth and sky. For Tony Snowden, the day began as hundreds had before it, a creature of habit moving through a world defined by the predictable cycles of water and machinery. The familiar, comforting rumble of his worn Ford Escort was a steadfast companion on the quiet country lanes leading to the great Culvert pumping station, a place of functional solitude, an outpost of industry set against the vast, indifferent canvas of nature, far removed from the thrum and chaos of city life. Tony, a man in his late 50s with hands calloused into maps of a life spent in manual labor, and a face etched with the quiet patience of one who works with the unhurried rhythms of powerful engines, was the pump attendant. His role was one of routine and repetition, a liturgy of checks and maintenance. He was a guardian of flow, the unseen hand that ensured the intricate network of drains and pumps, the very arteries and veins of this reclaimed land, kept the surrounding farmland from succumbing to its natural marshy state. The station itself was a stoic, utilitarian structure of weathered brick and stained steel, a monument to man's ongoing, quiet war with water. Its constant, low-frequency hum was the region's heartbeat, a sound so pervasive that Tony only ever noticed it when it stopped. That morning, the air was thick with the primordial scents of the Fens, damp earth, the sweet decay of wet vegetation, and the faint, metallic tang of the machinery that was his domain. Tony's first task, as always, was to check the debris screen. The Great Culvert acted as the final choke point for a vast network of waterways, and a wide metal grid, a kind of giant sieve, was stretched across the front of the main turbine intake to catch the flotsam and jetsam of the countryside. Fallen branches, agricultural runoff, discarded plastic, and all manner of refuse would pile up against the grid, a testament to the carelessness of the world upstream. If left unchecked, this relentless accumulation could choke the powerful pumps, silencing the station's vital heartbeat. He operated the small, crane-like grabber with a practiced, almost unconscious ease, its hydraulic arm extending over the dark, swirling water like a curious metallic limb. He lowered the mechanical claw, felt it bite into the dense mat of debris, and hoisted another dripping load onto the growing weed heap on the concrete bank beside the station. It was a messy, thankless job, but one Tony performed with a certain methodical pride. He was, in his own small way, clearing the arteries of the land, imposing a small pocket of order on a world that leaned always towards entropy. It was on his third or fourth pass that his rhythm was broken. Amidst the tangled mess of reeds, plastic bottles, and silt-blackened wood, he saw it, a black bin liner. It wasn't an unusual sight in itself. People dumped all sorts of things into the drains, using the waterways as their personal flowing landfill. But this one was snagged tight, and as the crane lifted the surrounding debris, the thin plastic, weakened by its time in the water, tore open. Something pale and oddly shaped tumbled out, landing with a soft, dull, sickeningly organic thud on the weed heap. From his perch in the crane's cabin, Tony frowned, a deep line forming between his brows. It looked wrong. Not like a piece of refuse. It had a weight, a form that didn't belong. He shut down the crane, and the sudden, profound silence amplified the gentle, insidious lapping of the water against the concrete. His steel-toed boots crunched on the gravel as he swung down from the cabin and walked over for a closer look, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. His dog, A scruffy terrier mix named Buster, who was his constant, loyal shadow at the station, had already bounded ahead. Buster was sniffing excitedly at the object, nudging it with his wet nose, his tail wagging in ignorant bliss. "Get away from that, you daft mutt," Tony called out, his voice a low grumble, rougher than he intended. As he got closer, his steps slowed. The world seemed to narrow. The ambient sounds of the morning, the distant cry of a bird, the rustle of wind in the reeds fading into a dull, rushing roar in his ears. The object was unmistakably, horrifyingly, a human arm. It was severed cleanly at the shoulder, the flesh a ghostly white, puckered and bleached from its time in the cold water. The fingers were curled slightly, as if grasping at some final, unseen thing. But it was the detail on the forearm that froze him in place, that stopped the air in his lungs and sent a spike of ice through his heart. In a faded bluish-green ink, a single word was tattooed in a messy, amateurish scrawl, a stark declaration against the pale skin, HAOS. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Tony Snowden simply stood there, his mind a howling void, refusing to process the abomination laid out before him. This was the stuff of television dramas, of grim newspaper headlines from faraway, violent cities. It was not the stuff of a quiet Tuesday morning at a pumping station in the Fens. A wave of acrid nausea washed over him, and he gagged, tasting bile at the back of his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird trying to beat its way out of his chest. He backed away slowly, his gaze locked on the dismembered limb, his boots stumbling on the uneven ground. He fumbled for his mobile phone, his thick, calloused fingers trembling so badly he could barely grip the plastic, let alone dial the numbers. "Police," he managed to say when a calm, impossibly distant voice finally answered. His own voice was a stranger's, a cracked and reedy thing. I think I've found something awful." Chapter 2. The Call and the Cascade. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment of the county police control room, time is measured in heartbeats and standardized responses. Tony Snowden's call was initially logged with the professional detachment born of necessity. Reports of strange finds were a regular feature of the daily log. But as the dispatcher, a young woman trained to listen for the nuances of panic, teased out the details, the explicit mention of a human arm, the remote location, the caller's palpable, stammering shock, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The low hum of routine police work was punctured by a spike of shared adrenaline. A call that might have been a minor incident became a critical, force-wide alert in a matter of seconds. The information began its rapid, inexorable climb up the chain of command, a spark ascending a fuse wire. The duty sergeant, hearing the gravity in the dispatcher's voice, immediately alerted the on-call inspector. Within minutes, the assistant chief constable, ACC, was being briefed over a secure line, his morning tea growing cold beside him. The words "dismembered," "human remains," and "pumping station" cut through the administrative chatter with the chilling clarity of a surgeon's scalpel. A major investigation was no longer a possibility. It was a grim and unfolding certainty. For Paul Davison, the day had also started with the familiar cadence of routine. As a newly promoted detective chief inspector, the weight of his new role as a designated senior investigating officer, SIO, on the major crime rota was a constant presence. It was a role he had strived for, but one whose reality was a far cry from the dramatic chases of fiction. That morning involved mountains of paperwork, tactical team meetings, and the endless, cascading waterfall of emails that defined modern policing. He was nursing a lukewarm coffee at his desk, staring at a screen of budget spreadsheets, when his office phone rang. It was not a normal ring, but the sharp, insistent, high-priority tone that signaled a sudden and dramatic shift in his world. It was the ACC. "Paul," the voice on the other end said, devoid of preamble, clipped and serious. "A limb has been found at the Great Culvert pumping station. An arm. Looks like a female. I need you there." "Your SIO." The words landed like stones in the pit of Davison's stomach. He was a veteran detective, a man who had spent years staring into the darkest facets of human behavior. But the specter of a dismemberment case was something else entirely. It was a different order of evil. It spoke of a level of violence and a cold-blooded, calculating defilement that was blessedly rare and profoundly disturbing. His mind, trained by years of experience, immediately began racing, constructing a mental checklist, firing off a series of critical questions to himself even as he absorbed the information. What am I going to do? The thought was not one of panic, but of the immense, sobering weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. The first few hours, the golden hours of any murder investigation, are absolutely, unyieldingly critical. Decisions made now, in the heat and confusion of the initial response, could determine the outcome of the entire case months or even years down the line. Evidence, fragile and fleeting, could be lost, contaminated, or overlooked. The mantra of every detective, the first lesson from the academy, echoed in his head: secure the scene and don't screw up. He grabbed his keys and coat, his mind already shifting from the administrative tasks of the morning to the complex, high-stakes chess game of a murder inquiry. As he walked briskly through the station, the news was already beginning to ripple through the ranks, a murmur of shock and grim speculation. He gave curt, clear instructions to his deputy. Get a cordon log started immediately. I want a full forensic team on standby, ready to deploy on my word. Get me crime scene manager Trevor Logley on the phone. Tell him to meet me there. Now, driving towards the fens, the car eating up the miles of tarmac, Davison watched the familiar urban landscape give way to open fields and vast, empty skies. Mothers were walking their children to school. People were heading to work. The world was moving to its normal, daily rhythm. Oblivious. It was a jarring, surreal contrast to the grim reality he was driving towards. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were already operating in a different, darker dimension that ran parallel to this peaceful one. He thought, his hands tight on the steering wheel, I would rather be doing anything other than this. There was a cold knot of apprehension in his gut, the quiet fear that every good detective carries, the fear of being out of one's depth, of facing a puzzle so complex and a killer so depraved that justice might remain forever just out of reach. Simultaneously, Trevor Logley, the force's most experienced and revered crime scene manager, CSM, was receiving his own call. Logley was the master of the scene, a forensic artist, the man responsible for ensuring that the chaotic, blood-soaked aftermath of a violent crime could be meticulously and systematically deconstructed to reveal the secrets it held. Where Davison commanded the overall investigation, Logley commanded the physical space where the crime was discovered, treating it with the reverence of an archaeologist at a sacred tomb. As he drove, Logley wasn't rushing. Haste, he knew, was the enemy of forensic integrity. Nothing is going to change and nothing's going to happen until I actually arrive, he thought, his mind a calm sea in a gathering storm. He used the travel time to plan, visualizing the scene based on the scant information he had. A pumping station, water, a body part, a large debris field. He began mentally assembling his team and resources. He would need his best forensic photographers, his most skilled evidence recovery specialists, and likely, given the location, specialist search teams, perhaps even divers. He thought about access points, contamination pathways, and the sheer logistical scale of what might be required. His job was to bring a cold scientific order to the most profound and emotional disorder imaginable. He had to ensure that every action taken, every exhibit bagged, every photograph taken at the scene would stand up to the intense, withering scrutiny of a Crown Court trial, potentially years down the line. The two men, Davison the investigator and Logley the forensic manager, two pillars of the same formidable machine, were now converging on a single point on the map, a lonely pumping station that had, in the space of a single horrific discovery, become the epicenter of a major murder investigation. Chapter 3. The Scene of Unspeakable Things. Upon arriving at the Great Culvert pumping station, Paul Davison was met with a scene of controlled professional activity that did little to soothe the disquiet in his soul. The initial responding officers, their faces grim, had established a wide primary cordon. The ubiquitous blue and white police tape was a stark, jarring line against the muted greens and browns of the fens, a fragile boundary holding back the ordinary world from the horror within. A single point of entry and exit was being meticulously managed, and a cordon log was in place, a simple but non-negotiable record of every single person who entered or left the secured area. Every signature was a potential variable, a possible point of contamination to be accounted for. Davison's first impression was one of small, professional relief. The entire station was enclosed by a high, 6-foot-tall metal fence, topped with rust. This immediately simplified the initial, critical task of scene security. Inside this perimeter, the environment was, for the moment, as sterile as it could be. Trevor Logley arrived shortly after, his large, fully equipped crime scene investigation van parking at the designated rendezvous point. The two men, who had worked together on numerous serious cases and shared a language of grim nods and unspoken understanding, exchanged a brief, somber glance. There was no need for pleasantries. They walked together towards the heart of the scene, their footsteps on the gravel the only sound besides the ever-present monolithic hum of the pumps. The head of the Scenes of Crime unit was already there, a man whose face was a pale, strained mask. He led them to the weed heap, and there it was. Laid carefully on a sterile white plastic sheet, where the first officers had moved it, was the arm. Seeing it firsthand was a physical blow, entirely different from hearing it described over a phone line. It was undeniably human, achingly fragile, its very form a silent scream. The word chaos seemed to shout from the pale skin, a declaration from a life now brutally, contemptuously extinguished. Logley began his methodical assessment, his eyes, missing nothing, scanning every detail. He crouched, his movements slow and deliberate. He noted the missing fingertips, a detail that could suggest post-mortem animal activity or something more sinister, a deliberate act of mutilation to hinder identification. He observed the black bin liner from which the arm had come. Now, a critical piece of evidence in its own right, waiting to be analyzed for DNA, fingerprints, trace evidence, manufacturing codes. His mind was already cataloging the forensic opportunities, the potential whispers of truth hidden within the physical facts. Tooling marks on the bone from the dismemberment, trace minerals from the water, fibers from a killer's clothing. Davison's focus was broader, more strategic. He was trying to read the story the scene was telling him. "The pumping station is remote," he observed aloud, his voice low, his gaze sweeping over the surrounding fields that stretched to a flat, unbroken horizon. "There's nothing surrounding it apart from fields. No houses, no people." He reasoned that if someone had dumped body parts into the drain, it was a deliberate choice, not an act of panicked opportunism. The location was chosen for its isolation. This was a calculated act. The killer had wanted to dispose of the body where it would not easily be found, where the currents would carry the evidence away to be lost in the vastness of the water system. The grid at the pumping station had been their undoing. It had acted as a sieve, an unintentional witness, catching what they had intended to be washed away and forgotten forever. While Logley began to direct his team, forensic specialists now arriving and donning their sterile white suits, transforming them into anonymous, ghost-like figures. Moving against the grim backdrop, Davison made a decision. He needed a different perspective. He needed a bird's-eye view. He called for the force helicopter. From the air, strapped into his seat, the scale of the challenge became even more terrifyingly apparent. The pumping station was a tiny island of industry in a vast, indifferent sea of green. The drain snaked its way across the landscape, a dark, silent ribbon of water. As they flew upstream, the view confirmed Davison's initial assessment. There was nothing. No obvious entry points. No bridges in the immediate vicinity. No houses overlooking the water. This was a dumping ground, not a murder scene. The killer had come here specifically for the purpose of disposal. The murder, the dismemberment that had happened somewhere else, somewhere they needed to find. Back on the ground, the radio on Davison's belt crackled to life. It was a voice he recognized, one of his senior forensic officers, but it was strained, tight with a new level of horror. Logley's team, meticulously sifting through the foul-smelling debris heap with gloved hands, had found another black plastic bag. It was heavier than the first, and it felt dense, solid. The question hung in the cold, damp air, unspoken but terrifying. What's in the bag? A senior forensic officer, with Davison and Logley watching from a respectful distance, carefully opened the sodden, knotted plastic. The stench that erupted was overpowering, a physical assault. The smell of advanced decomposition that caught in the throat and burned the nostrils. Inside, wrapped in another layer of plastic as if it were a precious, grotesque gift, was a human head. The sight was a vision from the deepest circle of hell. The features were almost completely gone, consumed by the inexorable processes of decay and the relentless, writhing work of maggots. There were no eyes, No nose, just a horrifying mass of liquefying tissue, matted hair, and bone. It was impossible to determine age or identity, but the long, dark hair suggested it was female. Even for seasoned veterans like Davison and Logley, men who thought they had seen the worst of humanity, it was a profoundly shocking, soul-shaking moment. A collective, involuntary gasp went through the small group of officers present. One of the younger constables turned away, his hand clamped over his mouth. "How on earth could anybody do that to another human being?" Davison murmured, his voice thick with a mixture of raw anger and disbelief. It was not a question that expected an answer. It was a lament, a cry into the void that had just opened up at their feet. This wasn't just a murder, it was a desecration. It was an act of absolute, nihilistic contempt for human life. The discovery of the head confirmed their worst fears. They were dealing with a dismembered body. Somewhere out there, in the water or scattered across the landscape, were more remains. The heart sank in Davison's chest. The initial crime scene had just expanded exponentially, its boundaries now horrifyingly unclear. Every inch of that debris pile had to be searched by hand. Every inch of the drain, upstream and downstream, had to be scoured by divers in the black, sightless water. The logistical, financial, and emotional burden on his team would be immense. He looked from the decomposed head to the severed arm. He had a victim, but she had no name, no voice, no story. His primary, urgent task, the first step on the long road to justice, was to give her one. The faded blue tattoo was his only real lead, a single word left behind in the wreckage of a life. Chaos. Chapter 4. The Chaos Tattoo. While the grim, painstaking search continued at the pumping station, a methodical, stomach-turning archaeology of horror, the investigation's first crucial breakthrough was taking shape miles away, in the quiet, methodical world of police databases and fluorescent-lit offices. The description of the arm, and specifically the unique, tragically prophetic Chaos Tattoo, was flashed across the force's computer network, circulated to all relevant departments, with a particular focus on the Missing Persons Bureau. It didn't take long to get a hit. In the vast digital ocean of data, a single entry snagged their line. The details matched a report filed just 2 days earlier, on May 14th. A man named Darren Adams had walked into a public phone box and reported his girlfriend, 9-year-old Natalie Clubb, missing. Adams, a known figure to local police with a string of minor offenses to his name, claimed he had last seen her working in the city's red light district. The missing person report, filed by an officer who had spoken with the seemingly concerned Adams, contained a crucial, electrifying detail. It mentioned that Natalie had a distinctive, self-administered tattoo on her forearm that read Chaos. Suddenly, the nameless, shattered victim had a potential identity. Natalie Clubb, a mother of 3. A woman who had fallen into the chaotic and perilous world of street-level sex work and drug addiction. The name echoed in the incident room, grounding the abstract horror in a human reality. Davison now had a name, a face to put to the nightmare. But in the cold, hard world of a murder investigation, a potential match was not enough. He needed confirmation. He couldn't unleash the tidal wave of grief that would follow by informing a family based on a strong possibility. He needed absolute scientific certainty. The focus of the investigation pivoted, shifting to the mortuary, where the arm and head had been transported and now lay in refrigerated silence. The atmosphere in the mortuary was a different kind of cold from the damp chill of the fens. It was a sterile, unforgiving cold, the air thick with the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic that failed to mask the underlying metallic scent of death. Under the harsh, unforgiving lights of the examination room, 2 fingerprint experts began the delicate and immensely difficult task of trying to recover a print from the waterlogged hand. The skin was fragile, the epidermis threatening to slip away from the underlying dermis. They worked with the painstaking precision of watchmakers, their every movement a study in concentration. Using specialized, almost alchemical techniques and powders, they carefully treated the palm, dusting and brushing with the lightest of touches. Slowly, miraculously, against all odds, a viable palm print began to emerge from the damaged tissue, a faint, ghostly map of identity. They applied the lifting tape, gently, expertly, peeling back a perfect, clear impression of the unique ridges and whorls. The print was mounted on a special card and rushed, under escort, to the Fingerprint Bureau for comparison against the police's national database. Natalie Clubb, due to a past minor arrest, had prints on file. The system began its search, comparing the print from the dead with the print from the living. The wait was an agonizing, suspended moment in time. Davison and his core team had gathered in the incident room, a space that was rapidly transforming from a collection of empty desks into the thrumming nerve center of the investigation. Whiteboards were being covered with timelines, names, and locations. The phones rang constantly, each call a potential lead or a dead end. Every detective in the room felt the oppressive, tangible weight of the clock. The first 48 hours were ticking away, and with every passing minute, the killer's trail grew colder. Then the call came. It was the head of the Fingerprint Bureau. His tone was professional but unequivocal. "It's a positive match. The palm print belongs to Natalie Clubb." A wave of grim confirmation washed through the incident room. There was no elation, only a deep, somber sense of purpose. Their victim had a name. The investigation could now move forward with a new, sharper focus. They weren't just investigating a collection of body parts found in a drain. They were investigating the murder of Natalie Clubb. This breakthrough, however, brought with it a fresh and daunting wave of challenges. Natalie's lifestyle was, by her own tattooed admission, chaotic. She was involved with drugs, sex work, and dangerous, desperate people. The pool of potential suspects was not a clear pond, but a vast and murky swamp. And at the very center of it all was her boyfriend and pimp, Darren Adams, the very man who had reported her missing. Was his report a genuine act of concern from a worried partner? Or was it a cynical, calculated, preemptive strike to deflect suspicion? Davison knew he was staring into a complex and treacherous underworld, a place with its own codes, its own brutal logic. His investigation would depend on navigating a world where trust was a foreign concept and alliances shifted like sand. But for now, he had a starting point. He had a victim, and he had a prime suspect. The game was afoot. Part 2. The Victim. Chapter 5. A Life Interrupted. With her identity now a certainty, the soul of the investigation underwent a fundamental shift. The focus was no longer solely on the cold mechanics of the crime, the what and the how, but on the deeply human tragedy of the who. Who was Natalie Clubb? The detectives knew that to understand the brutal endpoint of her life, they had to unravel the tangled, complex narrative of how she had lived. A dedicated team was assigned to the painstaking task of building a comprehensive victimology profile, of piecing together the fragmented, often contradictory story of her life from the memories of those she had left behind. What they uncovered was not a simple tale, but a story of profound and aching sadness, of a woman caught in a relentless tug of war between her deep, instinctual love for her family and the destructive, seductive forces of her personal demons. Natalie wasn't just another statistic from the red light district, another tragic headline. She was a daughter, a sister, and most importantly, a mother. She had 3 young children, born in quick succession during a marriage that had, for a time, promised her the quiet, conventional happiness she seemed to crave, friends and family. Their voices, thick with grief and regret, described her as a vibrant, laughing, fiercely loving mother, but one who was perpetually haunted by a troubled past and a restless, unquiet spirit. The chaos tattoo, her family explained, was a self-deprecating, painfully honest acknowledgement of the turmoil she felt she often brought into the lives of those around her. It was a brand she had given herself, a label for the internal storm she could never quite quell. Her marriage, unable to withstand the pressures of her inner world and the external strains of life, eventually crumbled. In the aftermath, seeking a fresh start, a mythical, brighter future for herself and her children, she made the fateful decision to move to the city of Hull. But Hull, instead of being a sanctuary, became the stage for her final, tragic act. It was there that she met Darren Adams. He was a predator cloaked in the guise of a savior. Charismatic, confident, and utterly controlling. A career criminal who preyed on vulnerable women. He drew Natalie into his dark orbit, expertly identifying and exploiting her dependencies, pulling her deeper and deeper into the suffocating world of heroin addiction and sex work. He became her boyfriend, her protector, and her pimp, a toxic, unholy trifecta that systematically isolated her from her family and trapped her in a brutal, degrading cycle of desperation. The detectives learned that the address where she had been living, 119 St. John's Grove, was more than just a home. It was the base of operations for Adams's squalid criminal enterprise. It was a place where Natalie would bring clients only for Adams to be lying in wait with a baseball bat or knuckle dusters to rob them. It was a nexus of crime, drugs, and violence, a festering wound in the heart of the community. The list of people who might have had a grudge against Natalie, or more likely against the violent and unpredictable Adams, was potentially endless. As the detective spoke with Natalie's estranged family, a portrait emerged of a woman they loved deeply but had been powerless to save. They spoke of her infectious laughter, her fierce, protective love for her kids, and the heartbreaking, late-night phone calls where the desperation in her voice was a palpable, living thing. They had watched from a distance, with a growing sense of dread, as the bright, hopeful young woman they knew was slowly consumed by the darkness of her new life.